a couple of the committees here at the museum. And I believe that everybody's got a story. And sometimes you just have to pull the right thread to find it. And sometimes you'll be surprised what you find. Tonight I'd like to tell 3 different stories. 2 men and 1 woman, all born to Irish parents, one in Scotland, one in Ireland, one in Troy. All 3 of them made their mark on history, and they all have this Troy connection. So the first is James Connolly. And everyone's heard about James Connolly. But not so many are aware of the fact that he lived and worked in Troy between 1903 and 1910. He had cousins in Troy, Margaret and Thomas Humes, and Troy had a large Irish population. In fact, the 2013 census showed that Rensselaer County, of which Troy is the county seat, had the highest percentage Irish population, or population with Irish ancestry, in all of New York State at 26%. And that, actually that surprised me. I would have figured part down around New York City would have a higher percentage of Irish ancestry. Anyway, James Connolly was born into poverty in Edinburgh in 1868, and he struggled to make ends meet for his whole life. And he also fought for his entire life for fairness and equality. While he's well known for his part in the Easter Uprising and his cruel death in Kilmainham jail, James Connolly was primarily a labor leader. And he believed that the labor movement was key in Ireland's struggle for independence. He said once, "If you remove the English army tomorrow and hoist the green flag over Dublin Castle, unless you set about the organization of the Socialist Republic, your efforts would be in vain. England would still rule you. She would rule you through her capitalists, landlords, and financiers." He had left school at the age of 11 to earn money to support his family. At 14, he lied about his age and joined the British Army, which was probably his best chance to make money, not to mention the fact that the Army provided 3 square meals. He was mostly stationed in Ireland, enforcing the oppressive landlord system against the poor Irish people. He was struck by the unfairness of a circumstance that the great British Empire was maintained by an army recruited from the poor to enforce a system that oppressed the very same poor and perpetuated their poverty. So he deserted the army and began to follow socialist writers and speakers. By 1903, he was 35 years old and struggling to provide for his young family. So he went to America to try and make them all a better life. He went alone to find work for himself first, with the plan that his family would follow afterwards. Sadly, his daughter Mona, the oldest of his 7 children, died of burns just the night before the family was going to sail to join him. Although he hoped to find work as a newspaper or socialist writer, James Connolly's first job in the U.S. was selling insurance in Troy, New York. And this is, that's a pretty old picture of his house at 447 10th Street, which was one of the 2 places he lived in Troy. After he left Troy, he worked as a lathe operator with Singer Sewing Machine Company in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and finally as a national organizer for the Socialist Party of America. So James Connolly became involved with labor organization, the International Workers of the World, commonly known as the Wobblies. He was an IWW organizer in the Bronx. And despite having left school himself at the age of 11, he taught himself Italian in order to communicate with Italian immigrant workers. He also taught himself some German, French, and Yiddish, and for the same reason, to help organize those workers. And this is a photograph of Union Square in New York on May Day, 1908. It's the only published photo of James Connolly during his time in the US, and one of the only times he was photographed speaking, and that's courtesy of the Library of Congress. James Connolly spent 3 years in the United States, and he toured the country as many times, traveling as far as El Paso, Texas, and Butte, Montana, which was a big copper mining town. He became painfully aware of the fact that many of his countrymen who had fled to the US to better or even save their lives were now living a pretty similar miserable existence here at the mercy of unscrupulous landlords, employers, and the company store system, where you could easily have spent your whole paycheck before you even receive it. Now, I have to say that I went to Catholic school during the Cold War years, when the socialists and the communists were our arch enemies, like comic book villain, capital letters, arch enemies. And so I really struggled to reconcile James Connolly, the hero of the Easter Rising, and James Connolly is socialist, because, and yet his socialism was just based on fairness and equity, so I can get it, it works for me that way. I do agree that what he found in oftentimes was unfair. R.M. Fox, Connolly's biographer and a historian of the Irish labor movement, said of him, he had gone away from Ireland a propagandist. He was returning a leader of men. He returned to Ireland in 1910, to a country in which industrialization had created a scourge of urban poverty. On Dublin's Henrietta Street, there were 15 houses that housed 835 people in one-room tenements. In one building, the Irish Sisters of Charity ran a Magdalen laundry inhabited by more than 50 women. An estimated 4 million pledges were taken by pawnbrokers every year. The infant mortality rate among the poor was 14%, extraordinarily high for any European city. The workers' situation was made even worse by the high rate of disease in the slums, ignorance of preventative hygiene, the lack of health care, and the cramped living conditions. The worst of those diseases was TB, which spread through the tenements like wildfire and caused many deaths. A 1912 report found that TB-related deaths in Ireland were 50% higher than England or Scotland, and that most of them occurred among the poor. And their poverty was perpetuated by the lack of work in Dublin for unskilled workers, who had no representation before trade unions were founded. These unskilled workers often had to compete with one another for a job every single day, with the job going to whoever worked for the cheapest wage. Employers who suspected their workers of trying to organize could blacklist them, destroying any chance they had of future employment. So James Connolly became an organizer for the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, and he was arrested for his role in the 1913 Dublin lockout, of which this is a picture, in which the factory owners locked their workers out of their jobs for more than 6 months. And ultimately, the Royal Irish Constabulary baton charged the protesting workers that were picketing outside the factories, beating 2 men to death, injuring hundreds, and raiding workers' homes in the nearby neighborhoods. Notably, just as an aside, Guinness, the largest employer and biggest exporter in Dublin, refused to lock out its workforce. It already had 400 staff members that were union members, and it had a good working relationship with the union. In response to the violence of the lockout, James Connolly organized a paramilitary unit called the Irish Citizen Army to protect striking workers when they were on the picket lines and to protect their homes from raids. And he was planning his own small-scale insurrection when Pearse and McDermott, fearing that his premature action might endanger their own plans for the Easter Uprising, brought him onto the Military Council for the Rising. And the rest, as we know, is history. On that Easter Sunday, James Connolly's participation and leadership in the GPO was considered unequaled. Michael Collins said of him, "I would have followed him through hell." He was shot once and had the wound dressed, but kept it to himself in order that no one else mention it. The second time he was shot in the ankle and his ankle was shattered, so he requested that he get a gurney on wheels so he could still get around to check on his men and their fortifications. He was wounded to such an extent that he had to be tied to a chair to face the firing squad. And this is the picture of Kilmainham Jail where he was killed, the yard in Kilmainham Jail. The cruelty of this execution, when he clearly had only a few days to live anyway, created such an outcry in the US and Ireland that no more of the rebel leaders were executed. In fact, many of them were released from prison after an unexpectedly short period of time, as in maybe a year or year and a half, which I'm sure seemed like a long time to them, but considering that it was that or the firing squad, it seems pretty lenient. In Troy, an historical marker was placed at the site where his home had been on 10th Street. It says, James Connolly, Republican Socialist leader of 1916 Easter Rising to win freedom for Ireland, lived at 447 10th Street and 96 Ingalls Avenue, 1903 to 1905. And this was erected at the site. The house had burned down in an arson fire, and it was so badly burned that it had to be razed. And it was erected around the 100th anniversary of James Connolly's execution. Another monument was erected in Troy's Riverfront Park in 1986. This was considered at the time to be one of the few, and possibly the only, monument to a revolutionary socialist erected in the United States. Then another one was put up in Chicago in 2008, a full statue near the headquarters of the United Electrical, Radio, and Machine Workers Union. Now, logically, since James Connolly's death saved the lives of his remaining comrades in the Easter Uprising, who then went on to complete the task of freeing Ireland, we all owe a debt to James Connolly, and maybe a debt to his time in Troy, which shaped his focus on the labor movement and ultimately led to his being part of the Easter Rising. Our second, pardon?
Somebody back there.
Oh. Our second person is John Morrisey. And he is probably unknown to a lot of people, yet the list of his accomplishments is amazing. He was born in 1831 in Templemore, County Tipperary. He was only 2 years old and his family moved to the United States and settled in Troy, where his father Tim worked odd jobs for meager wages. At the age of 12, John began working as a laborer in the Burden Iron Works because he was so strong and able to withstand long hours of grueling work. The Burden Iron Works would eventually make the steel plates for the Union submarine, the Monitor. But as a poor youth, John Morrisey fell in with a rough crowd and became a fierce fighter. Defeating 6 members of a rival gang in a single afternoon when he was 17 prompted him to abandon his job and become a fighter. By the time he was 18, he went to New York City, where he earned the nickname Old Smoke, which stayed with him for his whole life. And he earned it during a fight with a brawler named Tom McCann, not the famous one from Shoes. But during the fight, McCann pinned Morrisey on his back on top of some burning coals that had spilled out of a stove that overturned in the fight. As the coals burned into his back, an enraged Morrisey fought off his opponent and proceeded to beat him until he was almost unrecognizable. Ever since then, he was called by the nickname Old Smoke, and he became one of the most feared men in New York. He traveled out west during the gold rush, where he began participating in professional bare-knuckle boxing matches. He was more successful at boxing than panning for gold, and returned to New York to continue his boxing career. Seeing how fiercely he fought, he was given a job working for Tammany Hall, first as an emigrant runner. He would meet the emigrants at the docks, help them find a job and a place to live, help them find citizenship, including a bribable judge, all in exchange for only their support for Tammany Hall and vote for Tammany candidates. He also worked defending and supporting Tammany Hall supporters when they went to vote to make sure they weren't, it got pretty physical when you went in to vote in those days. In 1853, he challenged the famous Yankee Sullivan, the current bare-knuckle boxing champion. And in front of a crowd of 3,000, with boxing still illegal, he won after 37 rounds and became the American bare-knuckle boxing champion. That fight was immortalized in the song Morrisey and the Russian Sailor. Now, William Poole, also known as, so there's a picture of young John Morrisey, who looks like someone you wouldn't tangle with. And there's John Morrisey boxing. I forget about my slides. William Poole was known as Bill the Butcher. You would remember his character if you had seen Daniel Day-Lewis in Gangs of New York, with the great big waxed mustache and the meat cleaver. Well, William Poole was a terror to newly arrived Irish Americans. He and his gang, the Bowery Boys, worked on behalf of the Know-Nothings and the other nativist groups. What Morrisey didn't know when he won the boxing title is that Poole had lost a small fortune betting on Yankee Sullivan, and now Poole hated John Morrisey. In 1854, Poole and his gang viciously attacked Morrisey and his friends, who were protecting the ballot boxes. Morrisey saved the ballot boxes, but made an even worse enemy of Bill the Butcher. Later that year, in July 1854, the feud between the two men came to a head. Morrisey challenged Poole to a bare-knuckle boxing match. This was billed as Nativist versus Irish, Protestant versus Catholic. It was a matchup of blood and pride for their gangs and their people, and their points of view. Morrisey was a larger man and expected to win, and at first looked to be the clear winner. But Poole was a better boxer and took the upper hand when he flew a pulverizing rib punch to knock Morrisey to the ground. Poole gave him punch after punch while toppling Morrisey, gouging his eyes and biting a part of his cheek off.
Holyfield.
Yeah, they were tough guys. Poole was victorious and Morrisey was defeated but not dead, as his men dragged him off to the hospital. As he recuperated, Morrisey swore revenge. Brutal street fights broke out between the two gangs, resulting in the deaths of several gang members. About a half year later, two of Morrisey's close allies deliberately got in a fight with Poole at the newly opened Stanwix Hall. While the argument raged, Morrisey sat in a back room playing cards. Welsh immigrant Lou Baker drew a pistol, shooting Poole in the leg. Poole was taken away by his men, but the wound turned gangrenous and he died 2 weeks later. Though the nativists in the city mourned Bill the Butcher, many of those he terrorized breathed a sigh of relief. And despite numerous requests, the city refused to lower their flags to half-mast after Poole's death. Morrisey and Baker were charged with his murder, but they were released, as the jury could not reach a verdict. This was not considered surprising, as a number of them had been bribed.
Okay.
John Morrisey continued to box regularly until 1858, when he retired after successfully defending the title against longtime rival John Heenan. That match, which ended in an 11th round knockout, was considered to be the largest organized sporting event in America at the time. After securing the title, Morrisey kept a promise he'd made to his wife and stopped boxing. He used his winnings from the Heenan fight to open a series of high-end gambling houses. Then he took what he learned from New York City, to Saratoga Springs, operating his first club there on Matilda Street in 1860. His later club, built in 1870, and now known as Canfield Casino, is a National Historic Landmark. Wow. Oh, golly. So that's a portrait of John Morrisey that I think is in the Saratoga Hall of Fame Museum. 5 years after he built Canfield Casino, where he also kept his business offices, seeing a void in the horse racing circuit that was caused by the Civil War, he set up a 4-day experimental thoroughbred meet in Saratoga Springs. Just a month earlier, the Union Army had won 2 bloody battles at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, and had requisitioned every healthy horse it could find to further the war effort. Nonetheless, John Morrisey managed to convince several wealthy sportsmen to support racing at Saratoga, and the 32-year-old somehow found 27 quality thoroughbreds to run. The first official thoroughbred race was held at Saratoga on August 3, 1863. Probably wasn't quite that polished looking.
No.
That's a race at Saratoga.
Color photography.
He then enlisted 3 partners, William Travers, Leonard Jerome, and William Hunter, to finance construction of a grand racecourse on 125 acres which he had purchased. William Travers, you would be familiar with his name from the Travers Stakes, which is one of the biggest races held in Saratoga. Leonard Jerome, however, was Winston Churchill's grandfather. So the Saratoga racecourse opened its gate the following year, 1864. Morrisey's leadership delivered the first organized sports schedule in this country and played a colossal role in furthering Saratoga Springs as a summertime destination. In 1866, he was elected to the House of Representatives from the city of New York and re-elected in 1868. The year after that, although he had been backed by Tammany Hall for his seat in the House, Morrisey was among the first to publicly and actively oppose William Boss Tweed. A movement known as the Young Democracy was organized at Morrisey's home in 1870 and included allies including Utica's Samuel Tilden. The Young Democracy was defeated by the Tweed Ring, but Tilden would eventually bring down Tweed a year later with, of all things, yes, forensic accounting, just like Al Capone. Morrisey was closely allied with honest Sam Tilden, who was then elected governor of New York. And that would be I presume the Tilden that Tilden Avenue was named after here. While Tilden was rising, Morrisey shifted toward the New York State Legislature, winning a state Senate seat twice against Tammany candidates in 2 different districts. And that's a photograph of him when he was a little bit of an older gentleman. After winning so many fights, John Morrisey died of pneumonia at the Adelphi Hotel in Saratoga at the age of only 47. The New York State Senate called a recess for the day on the day of his funeral, and it's believed that all of his colleagues attended, along with more than 20,000 mourners lining the streets of Troy in a cold rain. He's buried in St. Peter's Cemetery in Troy. John Morrisey had married back in 1854 to Susanna Smith, the daughter of ship's captain called the Empire of Troy. That was a ship on the Hudson River. As such, Susanna Smith was exposed to luxuries of which many in those days could only dream of. She was also smart and went on to higher education at the Troy Female Seminary, now known as Emma Willard School, which was unique for its curriculum of math, geography, science, and history, instead of the usual higher education for women of conversational French and embroidery. The fact that she extracted a promise from her husband to give up boxing is indicative of her refining influence on him. And there's a picture of Susanna. But they only had one son, John Morrisey Jr., who died at the age of 21, followed by the death of his father 2 years later, after which Susanna found financial hardships and actually began working to make ends meet, sewing shirt collars in Troy. As her life progressed, so did her illness and impaired vision. She died in September 1898, nearly 20 years after her husband. And if you look at his gravestone, it only has his name inscribed on it, and that was rectified, I think, about 2 years ago by a group, that said it wasn't right that her name shouldn't be on the stone since she's buried there, and the Adelphi Hotel paid for the inscription. In 1996, John Morrisey was elected to the International Boxing Hall of Fame, and in 2018 he was inducted to the Pillars of the Turf at the National Museum of Racing and Hall of Fame in Saratoga. And the John Morrisey Stakes for New York-bred thoroughbreds, New York-bred horses, is run in his honor every summer at the racetrack for which he is best known. I personally was blown away by how much this man did and died at 47, because it doesn't seem like there's enough hours in the day for that. So he was, sometimes he seemed like a bad guy, sometimes he seemed like a good guy, but he sure wasn't a lazy guy. Nor was Mame Fay. Troy's famous madam was in business for almost 40 years, from 1906 to 1941. She was born Mary Alice Fahey, of Irish immigrant parents in 1866. And her parents were Thomas Fahey and Margaret McNamara Fahey. At that time, Troy was a booming mix of genteel Victorian old money, nouveau riche entrepreneurs, and a large immigrant labor force, working in the iron mills and the textile factories. Troy was known as the Collar City based on the Peabody shirt factory, where the detachable collar was invented for men's shirts. And it was also known as the City of Women, based on the thousands of women employed in the textile mills. Very little is known about Mary Alice's early life, or why she ended up going into prostitution as a livelihood. According to census and city directory entries, she married a man named G.A. Bonter, the owner of a saloon on River Street, and she was listed in the city directory as Mrs. Mary Bonter. They apparently either parted ways, or he died, or he left town, or maybe he never really existed. But she listed herself as either single or widowed in the 1910 census and thereafter. In 1904, when she would have been 38, a woman named Mame Fahey, not Mary Margaret Fahey, was arrested in a sweep of Troy's houses of ill repute. She next appears 2 years later as the purchaser of a row house on 6th Avenue, 3 buildings north of the police station, and across from Union Station, the train station in Troy, which at its peak had 135 passenger trains every day.
Wow.
And it was also right at the foot, so that's a 1929 photo looking south on 6th Avenue. Her house was on the right, the second house after the building that said Unita Biscuits. And so that's Union Station, which was also torn down during urban renewal.
Yeah.
That's a picture from the top looking downtown of the approach, which is a huge set of granite steps that led up the steep hill from downtown Troy up to RPI. And it was recently completely renovated, and that's how it looks. For a while it was pretty, the steps were uneven and the railings were gone. It looked pretty like it would take your life in your hands, but now it's back to its glory. And her house was right at the foot of it. The block on 6th Avenue, including Mame's house, the Notchery, was known as the Line. Maybe because the railroad line ran right through the street, just feet from the front door. And it was said that patrolmen from the police station 3 doors down would be stationed outside Mame's house on the busy nights. And in turn, she'd send over pitchers of hot coffee to the police station. Here's a flyer from the Line.
That is
Just
mac and cheese.
Attention given to
I
high
get
school
that
boys.
one. Joan, we gotta get that one. Thank you.
I'm particularly, pitch till you win for a deuce, and we will talk about the $2 rate later. But special attention given to high school boys and traveling salesmen. Words fail. The women often hung out in the local bars, the most notorious of which was Gainer's on Broadway, just across from the train depot. And if you look up the 1930s song In a Shanty in Old Shantytown, the lyrics talk about a little shack set right back 25 feet from the railroad track, where there's a queen waiting there in a rocking chair, just blowing her top on a Gainer's beer. In her heyday, Mame Fahey was known to walk through the downtown luncheonettes, asking girls how much money they made as secretaries and factory workers. And factory workers only made $15 or $18 a week. Then she'd laugh, invite them to come work for her for $100 a week, tell them they were sitting on $1 million, and walk away. In fact, a documentary was made about her in 2008 entitled Sittin' on $1 Million. It was also said, since the Line was right at the very foot of the RPI approach, that the bus taking the RPI team to an away basketball game frequently had to stop at some house on the Line to pick up an errant player. And according to a retired policeman, in the event that a customer died in one of those houses on the Line, the official report said he collapsed in the baggage room at the train depot. There's also a story of a Japanese prisoner of war who asked one of his captors where he was from in the United States. And when the GI said Troy, New York, the Japanese prisoner replied, Mame Fahey, Mame Fahey. Mame's nearly 40-year career as a madam coincided with a major shift in American attitudes toward prostitution. What the earlier Victorians had deemed a necessary evil became known as the social evil. A very effective public campaign was waged to prove that prostitution was the cause of all other social ills, especially venereal disease. Wildly overblown reports of white slavery swept the nation. This was one of the major American culture wars of the 20th century and ultimately led to the end of Mame Fahey's enterprise. But she had a lot of money and a good lawyer. I don't know if any of you recognize the name E. Stewart Jones, but if you were from Troy, you would, because he was and his son is now both very well known and well respected. And the present E. Stewart Jones's grandfather, Abbott Jones, was Mame Fahey's good attorney. Despite his efforts, and after decades of legal skirmishes, Mame's house was closed for good in 1941. The DA at the time made a big name for himself by clearing the social evil from the notorious corrupt city of Troy. Mame was forced into retirement at the very young age of 75 and lived with her brother-in-law until her death 2 years later. She left an estate of $282,000, which would be the equivalent of about $3.5 million today. She was known to be generous, a devout Catholic, a tough cookie, and fiercely maternal with her girls, the proverbial hooker with a heart of gold. Another part of Mame Fahey's lore is that every person in Troy has a Mame Fahey story. One of them was that Mame Fahey was taking a duffel bag full of money to the bank, and a woman called out to her, "Hey Mame, how's business?" And Mame shot right back and said, "It'd be a hell of a lot better if it weren't for amateurs like you."
Did she know this lady by
I don't know.
by name or what?
Well, it's a small town, maybe. Now, being a true daughter of Troy, I have two Mame Fahey stories. And one is pretty simple on the face of it. One rainy day, my grandmother, Mary McCarthy Ryan, was walking home to her house on 8th Street when Mame Fahey pulled up in her buggy and offered her a ride home. Well, that's simple enough, but it's also the most incredibly socially awkward situation you could ever be in those days. Mary Ryan knew that her reputation would be in tatters if she was seen getting into, riding in, or getting out of Mame Fahey's buggy. At the same time, how rude would it be to look the woman right in the eye and say, "I'd rather get drenched than be seen with you"? So, rather than be rude, she got in and took the ride home. To my knowledge, she never said whether they chatted or about what, or if there were any repercussions on the home front or in the neighborhood. Meanwhile, when my dad was in high school, he worked for his father after school and on weekends in his father's furniture store. And the furniture industry had just developed sort of a concept of selling furniture in suites, sometimes called sets or suits. And the parlor set consisted of a sofa and 2 matching armchairs. Well, one day they had a delivery to make, and it was to Mame Fahey's house. She had bought 2 parlor sets of real leather, not some kind of material, that sold for $1,400 each.
Whoa.
And 2 of them, unheard of. And my dad, as a student, was on the delivery truck. He said she paid cash on delivery, and maybe he was pulling our legs, but he said she paid the whole $2,800 in $2 bills. When we asked him what his mother said about his visiting Mame Fahey's house, his eyes got pretty big and he said, "Dad made sure we didn't mention that." Now, Mame Fahey's story is interesting and fun, and it paints a picture of days gone by. But one of her biographers asked a good question. Why are the hookers of the past colorful, while today's prostitutes are merely criminals? And I think that is something to think about. Anyway, in conclusion, I hope you've enjoyed learning a little more about these 3 people and their time in Troy, New York. But there are so many more stories untold and just waiting out there to be discovered. So if you take nothing else away from this, ask people, ask the older people you know, ask your relatives, ask your brothers and sisters, because they might have overheard or been told a story that you never happened to hear. and you might be amazed what comes out. So keep those stories alive because they're precious, and even the anecdotes kind of lend some color where when you look on Ancestry, you can get like a whole ton of data, but it's lifeless, it's bloodless. It's the little anecdotes about the, I know that Tim's father always did this when he was talking to you. And you see like nieces and nephews, like 3 generations down, doing that when they're talking. It's, so I'm in it for the stories. I hope everybody else is too. And thank you for coming out tonight. And yes?
In that fight that Morrisey had with his evil opponent there, was there any detail on how the victory was awarded?
Between Poole and
Yeah.
Morrisey? I think it was disputed.
Oh yeah. What happened was that Poole was taken back to his quote corner. I don't know if they had anything like a corner, but he was taken back by his guys and worked on, and then bing, the bell rings. Morrisey responds, the opponent doesn't. The officials go and awarded Morrisey the win by default, and that was what fueled a whole lot of that hatred.
Oh yeah, those two were.
Oh yeah, I mean there was a lot of money exchanged in a spurious way on that particular fight.
Yeah. And those fights were, I heard one person really say it was more like mixed martial arts than what we know
Yeah, it
as
was just
boxing.
Street fighting, pretty
Yeah.
much. I wonder when they decided to have something, when the Marquis of Queensberry started becoming holding sway over here in the United States. I don't think those. And there were still street fights and fights like this going on all over the place. And well into the 20s and 30s.
I have a question for you. Are you related to Judge James Foley?
No,
Okay. He was
I mean my father was. Oh no.
he was
no.
he was a big name in Troy. He's on the courthouse.
Oh okay, yeah. No relation.
Okay.
Because I'm still a Ryan, Even though I've been a Foley for 40 odd years. Anybody else?
What's your next topic gonna be? Because that was really good.
Yeah. We can't wait for the next one. Yay.